So, like many Techonomy sessions, this is the title of this about the sharing economy and cities and revival is sort of a big envelope to have what will likely be a wide-ranging discussion. But what's really nice about this is we have 3 people as opposed to 6, and each of whom has kind of a particular angle into this conversation. And so, from sort of the academic and the theoretical, although those do not necessarily follow. I mean, Aaron actually is much more applied than many of us, but we'll just call it that for the sake of argument. To Jennifer, who sort of straddles both the policy world and the studying from a intellectual perspective, and then Alex Rodriguez, who's joined us quite late from the. Now, are you in the mayor's office or the city manager's office? Or is it both?
Representing the mayors.
Representing the mayor of Tucson. So really sort of applying what does it mean to try to grapple with these ideas. I mean, one of the great challenges of everything that we're talking about at Techonomy and everything that many of us grapple with is there's this fluid world of platonic ideas about how to make the world a better place or how to match up our tools of technology with our needs in the most seamless, fluid, integrated fashion, and that's all wonderful. I mean, I've always felt like if one's going to pick a degree of excess, go to the utopian end of the spectrum any day of the week rather than the cynical end of the spectrum any day of the week. So that, I think, is not only all fine and well, but is utterly imperative. That being said, it's complicated to then take wonderful ideas, and particularly when it comes to running a city or a municipality, which are as messy and labyrinthine, even as they're smaller, as you can imagine. How do you translate those ideas into something meaningful that's actually going to impact people's lives? And Techonomy Detroit, I know David just walked in, was an incredible experience, at least for me, largely counterintuitive, because you think going to Detroit would not be the happy-go-luckiest of experiences, and yet the energy of people in that particular city of trying to find ways to implement these tools of social media technology sharing as a way of being the leading wedge to urban revival, or I guess in the case of Detroit, really urban rebirth or recreation, was extremely stimulating to see, albeit with a full recognition by everybody who was involved in this that the chances of failure were high. But the chances of failure were certain if these things weren't tried. So it wasn't a question of will this work. It's a question of we either try this stuff or nothing's going to work. And I'm not trying to put Tucson in the same. That was just we happened to do Techonomy in Detroit. No commentary on Tucson, and it's over there anyway. So let's begin with Aaron Sundararajan. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Thank God. The mellifluous and yet devilishly complicated. You must be terrible calling people up on the phone.
That's like Sam, you like umbrella, and Nancy, you like David.
Who's a professor at NYU, trained as an economist at the University of Rochester, and has been really looking at the evolution of these various social sharing media. Particularly, I think you've been doing a good bit of discussion, particularly in New York, about Airbnb lately, and how that challenges or does not challenge both existing modes of business and the regulatory framework and all that. So why don't you give us just here's what Aaron's brain dump thinking for 5 minutes or so, and then we will move on.
Okay, you said 5 minutes.
Well, there's going to be a lot more time. Yeah. No, you can just speak for 70. We'll just sit.
All right. Okay, so yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks. I guess I've been fascinated by what people call the sharing economy. I've started to call the sharing economy because it's it seems to be sort of the culmination of a bunch of different promises. There was the promise that all of the social information that was being taken out of the real world and brought online would someday sort of facilitate more seamless interaction, commercial interaction between people. There was the promise that the powerful computers that we carry around with us would allow us to, in a way, re-engineer the way we consume, much like sort of 20 years ago, the powerful computers that were made available to companies allowed them to say, well, we don't really need to work this way. We can sort of re-engineer our production. So now we've sort of got the promise of re-engineering of consumption. And there's a host of other factors which we might sort of get to as we get along. But I thought we'd start by sort of at least drawing a first circle around what we mean by the sharing economy. We all know what cities are, the other part. And if we don't know what cities are, this afternoon we'll sort of make sure that we do. So I see the sharing economy as a label that's being given to a set of, I call them business models, but they don't have to be sort of for profit, but a set of models that are allowing people access to things without them having to own them. And it's sort of as simple as that. And so, so this means that this is not an entirely new idea. We've been carpooling for a long time. We have rented cars for many decades. We have stayed in hotels. We have used parks. We have used public transportation. So all of these sort of fall under this idea of access without ownership. Now, I guess what's different and exciting now at this point in time is that we are seeing a scaling of this kind of access without ownership or sharing activity because of digital marketplaces and sort of predominantly VC-backed, sort of like hyper-growth digital marketplaces like Airbnb and Lyft and Uber and Sidecar and Relay Rides and sort of the list goes on, Snapgoods. And because of this, there's sort of there's one set of things that come to mind when we say sharing economy and when we say sharing. There's a set of communities that believe in cooperatives, that believe that sharing has to do with the community sort of producing and then the community consuming. There's a set of communities that believe in sharing as a way of reducing our environmental impact. And so these people and these ideas are now sort of coming in conflict in some sense with this new quote-unquote sharing economy. And so, when people, I started with this introduction because when you say sharing economy, it sort of conjures up an image of different things in different people's minds. And I thought it would be useful to say, well, here's sort of what it is, access without ownership.
So it's a little bit different, though, than the other model of we all use public parks and we all use sort of some of the commons. And even then, when individuals started to want to take care of those commons in a way that the municipality or that the collective government wasn't involved in, there was a period of real tension, right?
Yeah.
If someone cleans up the parks, this was before the Central Park Conservancy in New York.
Yep.
Who's going to be responsible if the tree falls and someone dies? So this whole butting of heads now with Uber and taxi and limousine unions and Airbnb and hotel unions.
Yep.
And the tech response is, this is the next wave, and they're fighting a rearguard action, and soon enough, all the walls will crumble, and we're all just going to be transacting business. But is that the case?
Well, I mean, you bring up sort of two interesting points, right? One is the commons problem, that historically, if we've wanted shared access to something, we faced a public goods problem wherein, there's a natural sort of tendency for these systems to evolve to a point where, you can't sustain them because people are taking more out of them than they should or taking more out of them than they're giving. And so there's a limit to which you can sort of scale a ride-sharing cooperative or a babysitting co-op or, a food co-op. But there's also the regulatory aspect, which is that, I think of cities as sharing economies. I like to say that New York City is a sharing economy and has been for many decades. And because it has been, we've evolved as a city a whole bunch of safeguards for these sharing activities. We regulate taxis in part to keep them safe. We regulate hotels. We regulate sort of what you can and can't do with your apartment. And we regulate restaurants in order to sort of keep our shared collaborative consumption, so to speak, safe. And so, the fact that we have these regulations isn't a surprise. And the fact that these regulatory issues are perhaps most heightened in New York City isn't a surprise, because it's something that you'd expect to be characterized by a city where the sharing economy, the old analog sharing economy, was most active. And densely populated urban areas are sort of like, best suited for this kind of sharing activity. And now you've got the new models and you've got the old regulations, and the new models don't fit into the old boxes. What complicates things here further is that, unlike when internet radio came along, this sort of conflicted with some FCC regulations about, sort of geographic scope. But you could sort of solve those regulatory challenges at the federal level. What we're talking about here are city and state regulations, and especially sort of local government. Mm-hmm. And so the battle to sort of create a new regulatory infrastructure is likely to be slow and likely to sort of be local rather than something that, a federal agency can sort of solve with the swoop of a pen.
So Jennifer, this is a good segue to some of the work you've been doing. Jennifer Gladley is a fellow at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, and is the co-author of a recent book called Metropolitan City.
Metropolitan Revolution.
Thank you. Metropolitan Revolution. I was going to guess that eventually.
Great.
And is trained as both a lawyer and a public policy practitioner, and was at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, which just has to be part of your ongoing bio for the next 30 or 40 years. And you've really written about the way in which cities are these fonts of innovation, creativity, nimble addressing of problems. I mean, I'm sure you saw Ben Barber has a sort of provocative new book, Mayors Ruled the World. That's probably not the title either, because
No, you got that.
I got that one right. So he's not even here, so that really. I'm bad at catchy titles for my own books too. I mean, I really suck about that. But so there is this kind of wave of cities are the laboratories of good governance, and from Denver to Portland to Houston to San Francisco to Tucson, just threw that in there kind of. These are places where you have everything the government should be: responsive, technology, innovative, creative. So, I mean, I guess talk about that a bit, and also talk about, if you could, some of the stuff that Aaron touched on in the end, which is it's not all just this easy. We've got a great mayor, and he really thinks the internet's cool, and so we're going to have apps that allow people like Cory Booker,
right.
my garbage isn't being picked up, and he tweet him, and he says, give me your address, and I'll send someone out.
I'm there in my car, yeah. So. One of the things that struck me about what Arun says is we all know what a city is. I think that what a city is, what a metropolis is primarily a network. And that makes cities and metros uniquely creative in terms of policy responses and in terms of the resources and ideas they have for economic development. And I have to say, I am borrowing heavily from John's ideas, which were absolutely foundational for some of the work I did in the book. The thing about cities and metropolitan areas being these networks is that if one element of the network sort of goes down, you have the other elements of the network that can fill in. So you were talking about Techonomy Detroit, right? Detroit, famously, the city government is in bankruptcy. Yet at the same time, you've seen $1 billion of private capital invested in the downtown and midtown area through private entrepreneurs like Dan Gilbert, a lot of deals being facilitated by nonprofits like the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, Midtown Detroit Inc., Henry Ford Health Centers. You see this rich ecosystem of philanthropies, the Kresge Foundation, the New Economy Initiative, creating a stronger infrastructure, whether that's the M1 rail line or this infrastructure of deal making and incubators. So that demonstrates the power of a network. And what makes a network powerful, right, is the ability of people to share resources, to share ideas, to be able to come together jointly to solve problems. So I think it's no accident that you're seeing the shared economy take root in cities, not just because of the density, but because that's kind of what draws people to cities in the first place. That's what makes cities work, is this notion of We are all bringing something to the table, and none of us is sufficient unto ourselves. And when we talk about cities, I do think it's very important to talk not just about the city government. A lot of city governments are facing pretty significant fiscal stresses, either now or in the future, because of pension crises and other unfunded kind of mandates or things that they have to do that they're not able to pay for yet. So growth is going to have to come, again, from this cooperative, linked, shared understanding that everybody is responsible. A lot of different entities and organizations are responsible for the growth of a city. If you pull that out to the metropolitan level, that's even another level of sharing. And if you think we don't have a great regulatory process for things like Uber or Airbnb, we have a terrible regulatory and legal structure for sharing between jurisdictions, right? A tax dollar that Tucson gets is one that Phoenix or Mesa or any of these surrounding jurisdictions absolutely does not get, despite the fact that they often share labor markets, they share environmental concerns. We've kind of figured out how to make some kinds of infrastructure more shared between municipalities, because a road doesn't do you any good if it stops at city borders. But that didn't stop people from creating a bus system in Detroit that did stop at city borders. So I think what's exciting about the shared economy, when we think about it in terms of shared consumption, is how much it can teach us about shared production, shared infrastructure, and how much it can reinvigorate our sense of the old-fashioned sharing economy, which, as Aaron pointed out, we used to call public, right? Public space, public transportation, public parks, public schools. Can we think more, if we learn how to share, right, our houses, right, our bedrooms, our cars, our power tools, can we learn how to share tax base? Can we learn how to share other kinds of resources? Can we learn, as they've modeled in Denver, how to share economic development resources so that when a company wants to locate in the Denver region, you've got all of the municipalities in the region doing everything they can to bring that company to Greater Denver. And then they're, a little agnostic about whether the company settles in Littleton or Denver proper or Aurora, because everybody there understands that having the company there has greater effects, and everybody can benefit from that. We've seen the possibilities of this happening in places like Denver, in Northeast Ohio, where they've cottoned on to the power of networks. And I think that will be trying to scale up the sharing economy kind of mentally, philosophically, and politically is a very exciting place to watch. And I think that those metropolitan areas and those leadership groups that understand this and can build on this metaphor and build on this practice will be the ones that will be flourishing into the future. And places that still hold on to this notion of it's got to be just for my jurisdiction or it's got to come just from the local government are going to be places that fall apart pretty spectacularly.
What about the public-private part? I mean, I remember, and I actually don't know what happened with this, so I may be well behind the time. I mean, there was a point like 10 years ago where Philadelphia was trying to do free high-speed or digital wiring, and then that got halted by a consortium. So the Detroit thing is interesting in that if cities are like completely bankrupt and totally desperate, they'll take just about anything because, again, the option is to really collapse. But a lot of these initiatives, particularly when they're coming from the private, not just the private sector, private, individuals and collectives, do meet resistance, right? I mean, you can say, look, I want to. The charter school movement is part of that, right? That's another sort of way of people doing things. Where does that stand right now, where the willingness of governments to not solve certain problems because you've got a group of other concerned citizens or businesses that's saying, hey, we'll do it, which would have been the case before you had centralized governments develop, right? So basically, when they don't exist, everyone just tries to make do, and private associations come together and they solve stuff, and whether that's technology or not. Now you have these governments that are increasingly, even if they can't do it, they're not necessarily willing for someone else to do it. So where does that stand now in across the countries?
I think that you bring up an interesting point about the intersection, and is it an intersection or is it a clash between this kind of DIY, we're going to do it ourselves. It's, we're going to adopt a fire hydrant, right, which was a Code for America project, or we're going to be a neighborhood watch blight remediation squad, as you had in Detroit, with our notions of accountable, democratic, representative government. In a place like Detroit, I think people have lost their faith in traditional representative government, and they just really need that blighted house boarded up, so they don't really care who's doing it. And so far, there haven't been any problems with them, boarding up a house that stays still habitable, or there hasn't been this kind of democracy conflict. I think in more functioning places, you will start to see this renegotiation of the public and private boundary, right? You've got things like business improvement districts. Well, why do you need to join a bid? Aren't you paying city taxes to get this kind of stuff done? So I'd be really interested to hear how Tucson and other municipalities are working this out. I don't have a set solution, but as somebody who spent a lot of time studying political theory and political philosophy, this sort of semi-privatization, is Uber public or private, right? Is shared public or private? I don't always know how to assign that. And I don't know, I think it's generally better that things get done than that things don't get done. But we do have this thing called representative government. We have government for a reason. It can't do everything, but it shouldn't do nothing. And I think cities all across the spectrum are trying to figure out where on that continuum between nothing and everything they want to land, particularly as their own resources get squeezed. So what are they going to outsource? What are they going to turn over to networks of philanthropies and public and private actors? I think you'll just see a taxonomy of different cities making different kinds of choices.
So this is a good segue for Alex Rodriguez, who's taken out some of his time, shown up rather quickly, and I know the whole thing with Major League Baseball must be a big distraction for you. So it's great that you could show up here. You have an incredibly impressive bio and resume, Alex. In addition to having a master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School, has also served as a captain in the reserves, military. Is a local. You grew up in this area, part of the mayor's office now for technology and a variety of other issues. And I'm wondering, one thing that's been true of Tucson is, so you have the development here, right, Dove Mountain, which is actually not part of Tucson proper, right? Even though we say it's Tucson, it's not, and the benefits of the development of this area, I guess, do not flow, right? So that's a good segue, I think, Jennifer's point about not just the sharing economy in the sense that Aaron is talking about, which is individuals sharing services, but also sharing in a geographic collective to meet collective needs.
Zach, I'm here as a pinch hitter, but hope to hit a grand slam for all of you today. So, first, on behalf of the City of Tucson Mayor Jonathan Rothschild, he welcomes all of you to Tucson and to this pristine location we're in. Isn't it amazing? About 4 or 5 days ago, I was in Wisconsin. And when I left, the white funny stuff started coming down. So, I learned to appreciate where I'm originally from, the Southwest. But in any event, I wanted to say that I'm inspired by Techonomy's vision, and definitely the convening power that's represented here today. The mayor is interested in transformation. And he believes that the sharing economy can be a part of fostering a transformation for the city of Tucson and its residents, its citizens. But he's not only the mayor of Tucson, he sort of acts in his role as a city mayor in the interest of the region. Because as you might know, the city of Tucson is the largest city outside of metropolitan Phoenix. As a result, it's kind of a unique situation. So he gets involved in issues that maybe are not as common, if you will, for other mayors. He's heavily engaged with the agenda with Mexico, for example, and the issue of trade and immigration and so forth. Now, having said that, I'm being on television, there's a jurisdiction that we're in. Collaboration between jurisdictions is very, very important, and that's something that is of interest to the mayor. We've recently had annexation issues, and parts of southern Arizona look to establish their own cityscape. So I'm also here, Zach, sort of dual roles in my role as director of the Arizona Technology Council. And just briefly there, the Arizona Technology Council is the premier trade association in the state for science and technology companies. There's a like association probably somewhere near where you live. So what we're trying to do in the state of Arizona, our vision is very simple, is to be the driving force behind making the state economy one of the fastest growing, leveraging technology for economic growth. I think if the mayor were here, he would tell you first that he was very proud to sign Resolution 87. In broad terms, it defines essentially what Arun is talking about and Jennifer with respect to the principles, the promise, and the possibility of the sharing economy. What does that mean exactly on a day-to-day basis to people like myself that work with the mayor and others in the city staff to make things happen? By the way, I don't work for the city of Tucson. So I'm here as a representative of the mayor's office, but not part of the city bureaucracy, as it were. You may get a whole different outlook if maybe the city manager's staff was here. His interest is obviously to foster efficiency where efficiency can be had. I think what's driving this from a policy perspective is the question, well, how can we, in light of the sharing economy, achieve the optimal public good? That's a difficult question that's always front and center in everything that a mayor does or does not do. What could be the optimal public good? There's political limitations, there's bureaucratic limitations, there's policy limitations, there's talent limitations, and on, tax-based limitations. So that's an important question to ask when considering issues like the sharing economy. And frankly, we know that citizens and the public sector are usually light years ahead of what the government is doing, what a particular government agency is doing. And so maybe to add color to this dialogue here, one of the dimensions of the city of Tucson is that obviously we're in Arizona, right? We have big open spaces and therefore big open spaces within the city. There's no core urban density issue or part of town as there is maybe down in Soho, in Greenwich Village, or other part in San Francisco or Boston. That's partly a challenge when crafting public policy in a city like this. It's a lot more dispersed, a lot more open, and therefore different challenges apply to that. So just as an opening, Mayor's happy to have all of you guys here, and I'm happy to join you guys.
Sorry. On that sort of the challenge of open spaces, right? A lot of the people who develop these tools that we're talking about do come from more urban, dense neighborhoods. Younger people who may not own a car. Some of the sharing is it's cheaper to do it if you don't have the money to pay for it. And certainly one of the challenges in a place like Tucson is public transportation or the lack thereof.
Yes.
I mean, that's not a Tucson challenge. That's true of almost any Western city. I mean, Denver ameliorated it. That took a long time. And,
Right.
Not the easiest thing to convince people. Things like the Uber equivalent in a place like Tucson, where it wouldn't even be people calling up a professional and paying, but it literally be, hey, I'll give you a ride, right? And apps make that possible in a way that you used to hitchhike. And people actually feel much more trusting of the app side of it because you've registered your information, so you're not as worried that a stranger is going to pick you up and do something odd because all their information is there, presumably, and they would easily be caught. But cities don't usually like this stuff. And they're like, we shouldn't just allow people to be driving around and picking people up. But it would be a really good solution to how do you get people from point A to point B without spending $1 billion on a transportation network that you're not even convinced people would use.
Very true. The transportation issues here have historically been a big challenge, and most recently, it's that area is fraught with politics. I do want to point out, I think we do have Uber in Tucson. Justin just launched recently, and it was
University downtown core.
Is it the Uber X parts of it? I mean, I'm sure this is like one of the only rooms that people with actually know the different classifications of Uber services.
They launched with Uber X specifically because I think of the college demographic and the sort of lower income status.
Right. Uber X is you use your own car and you pick people up for those. It's much more equivalent to the the app thumb.
Yeah. No, and I mean, Uber was featured at a Angel conference recently too, where Justin was involved in. I mean, just very unique to this community. We just approved light rail recently, and it's now being constructed in the downtown and university area as well for that same reason, density. But we have, again, those vast open places. The big transportation issue for us is, do we approve an intra-city highway or not? And that historically, depending on what side of that equation you are, people don't like that change. They don't want to see that big highway coming through as you have in, say, Phoenix.
I mean, Aaron, does a lot of the stuff that you're looking at, do you think it works once you take it out of a sort of concentrated urban core?
I mean, I think that there are certain things about a concentrated, densely populated urban area that are naturally attractive to sharing economy models. And so, the ability to rent a vacuum cleaner from your neighbor is much more appealing if you can sort of walk down the street and pick it up. Less appealing if you have to drive 10 miles to get it and, come back. The same thing with a power drill. There may be 80 million of them, but you're going to buy one more and keep it in your garage, rather than participating in a marketplace. But I'm thinking about this video that I saw on YouTube. It's a rendering of the carpooling.com network. Carpooling.com is a city-to-city ride-sharing service that operates, I think, in like 45 different countries in Europe. They're not active in the United States yet. They're threatening to launch in that sort of Boston, DC, New York, SLR corridor any day. But they sort of have this, they show you this map of all the different rides that people are taking. And you look at it, and it looks like a transit system. You can sort of, this is what exactly, you think that it's the high-speed rail, but it's not. It's, and so from that point of view, going back to sort of like, what we were talking about 5 minutes ago, there's certainly a tremendous amount of potential for sort of long-distance transit, sort of in an area like, like Tucson. That is represented by the sharing economy. It may not be the UberX model necessarily.
We can call it with when Harry met Sally.com ride service.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think that there's
the beginning
also
of the movie.
there's also probably opportunity in some of the other sectors, right? I mean, another map that is always compelling to me, and I sort of want to I want to be at the point where I could take out my phone and sort of project it in the air, and you guys can see what I'm talking about. That's not going to happen today, but maybe next year. But this is, if you look at where the Airbnbs are located in New York City, and you look at where the major hotel chains are located, where these are almost completely distinct. In some sense, it's representing a desire. I mean, it could partly be because, down Times Square is not a residential area. But there's certainly a desire to sort of increase the short-term accommodation footprint that is sort of represented in where these things are. And, that's certainly something that isn't sort of densely populated urban area specific. And so, if there are particular neighborhoods that are desirable to stay in, they will sort of be natural magnets for sort of short-term accommodation through an Airbnb-like marketplace.
I mean, Jennifer, do you see this as, so a lot of municipalities, again, focus on the kind of the big infrastructure projects sometimes because they have to. But even there, you could imagine things like as energy grids shift, you could share a photovoltaic cell, right, for your energy use, and the utility grid would drive them nuts because it would be outside of that particular realm. But are there things that are particular to more dispersed environments versus more concentrated? Do the models just work as well? They just have to be adapted differently?
One of the things that I think is an interesting area of potential is if you look at the new geography of poverty, you see a lot more. We used to think of poor people living in very dense environments in the central city, and that's often true. But numerically, not percentage-wise, but numerically, there are more poor people living in the suburbs than there are in the cities. One of the challenges that these people have, right, is access to work. Because even though there are a lot of jobs in the suburbs, they tend not to be in the jobs, they tend not to be in the suburbs where poor people live. So something like UberX, right, or these informal carpool or vanpool systems could be incredibly important for neighborhoods that are full of people who need to get places that the transit grid doesn't go. But I haven't seen any, studies about it, but the people who talk about Uber and shared economy and how exciting it is tend to be people with a lot of resources who are just choosing to opt out, right? People who could buy a car, but who are saying, God, why do I want to deal with the hassle? So I think it's interesting to see if cities can serve, and by city I mean city governments, but it could also be a particularly entrepreneurial nonprofit or other kind of philanthropy or social entrepreneur trying to get people who don't necessarily have resources and who could benefit most from the sharing economy around transportation, around other kinds of big fixed cost resources, getting them into it, right? A lot of low-income people do have cell phones. So is there a way that you could use cell phones, maybe not through an app, but some other way to connect people and have a city regulatory infrastructure that supports that as opposed to trying to regulate it out of existence? I haven't seen any place, you're saying no. Okay. I haven't seen any place that has said, wait, let's figure out Uber and make it work for poor people who need to get, from one side of the metropolis to another. I think it would be great if we thought about, the sharing economy for low resource people as opposed to high resource people for whom this is, a fabulous thing to talk about at a conference.
And just identify yourself.
My name is Justin Williams. I'm with Startup Tucson. My question is, are there inherently shareable resources in that space? I mean, if you're looking at it from city planning perspectives, or if you're looking at it from just sort of future forward thinking, where do you see sharing? We're seeing it in automobiles, really expensive assets. Are there inherent characteristics that will make these things naturally shared, where we should be looking at and looking for the next round of this? And in particular, then, in the case of cities, where do you see that overlapping with the role that city can play?
Well, you've covered accommodation, short-term accommodation, transportation. These are the ones where there is the most potential because you have a lot of underutilized assets, especially transportation, and because there is a lack of sort of public transportation options across most of the cities of the United States. I think an area of considerable interest to a lot of cities is disaster recovery. This is not something that is, and I mean it in the following way. After Hurricane Sandy in Manhattan, in New York, we saw a lot of information flow on the typical networks that we're used to. Twitter was very valuable. Google Maps, people sort of built apps on Google Maps. A lot of us didn't have internet connections, and so that was sort of a bit of a challenge. But, one of the things that the sharing economy platforms represent is not just platforms for information, but platforms for access to resources. And so, in a, I think about it, Airbnb tells me that 1,300 people offered up their apartments through the platform as sort of free short-term accommodation for people who were displaced. Now, this is a small number, but it is also reflective of the fact that there was no prior partnership in place, and this was completely ad hoc. We shared cabs because there was a shortage of taxis. But you can very easily see sort of an existing ride-sharing applications sort of being repurposed on the fly. And I think that the opportunity here actually is greater for sparsely populated urban areas than for densely populated urban areas, because in some sense the challenge for a city government seems to be greater there if you have sort of a more broadly dispersed. I also think there's a lot of opportunity in the shared, in what we use restaurants for now. It's certainly not something that, of course, food is a basic need and all of that, but it's not so much towards sort of socioeconomically disadvantaged populations, but in terms of this being a space that is growing and that is going to pose challenges for city governments as to if you have sort of marketplaces that come along that allow people to sort of open up their dining tables to other people.
Although clearly, you need cell towers, smartphones, and electricity for that to work. That's sort of like the bare minimum. Otherwise, you can't.
Yes,
you can't do it. In the U.S., we have 2 of those. We don't necessarily have all the third. David, did you want to? Oh, sorry, Alex.
Just to piggyback, while the microphone makes its way, on the comments and maybe framework, a little bit more framework from a city perspective anyways, what potentially, as the sharing economy continues to grow, to find new ways to adopt and so forth, at what point are there policy implications that are unintended, negative consequences, or just to say it in political terms, whose ox are you now goring, right? You enter a market space that is an established market space and you disrupt it in essence because you're now no longer channeling that foot traffic to that particular business.
Yeah.
So it's redirecting of where resources go. I really liked what Jennifer mentioned as far as defining what the shared economy promises and certainly how it applies. Where is the optimal application for the sharing economy? I could easily see interest groups pop up and say, don't you dare do that for X, Y, and Z reasons.
That's a really good point. David?
I just wanted to follow on some of the things that Jennifer was saying, and maybe what we heard earlier about what Tucson's recently done with this particular initiative is a step in this direction. But the question is, have there been cities that have basically said, look, economic conditions are so-and-so now or projected to be so-and-so in the future. Therefore, we have to do this because the nature of the future population's earning power, et cetera, et cetera. And in other words, just a purely pragmatic, we've sort of heard about it in this discussion as a little more idealistic and not so much just purely pragmatic given the direction of employment and incomes, which I frankly am concerned about. And so I guess I also wanted to ask all of you, but especially Aaron, how much you think that at a macro level, this is becoming a necessity as time goes on. Because of, what you think of as, economic directions. But first, I'd love to hear any of you, particularly Jennifer, talk about this more on this pragmatic short term.
What is this that you're talking about? Is it the sharing economy or?
The sharing of resources for people who now and possibly in future will never be able to afford them in traditional fashion.
I haven't seen any city government or nonprofit that I know of think about the potential of, or at least using the name of the shared economy to talk about helping people without resources have access to resources, right? There have always been kinds of, informal van pools and carpooling. And the way those usually interacted with the city government was the city government would bust them up for being unregulated. Now, I'm going to sound like the Jewish mother that I am. When I look at I can certainly understand the city regulator's point of view, which is it's all a lot of fun until somebody gets hurt, right? The unregulated van carrying a bunch of, young women to work in a hotel crashes and they all die terrible fiery deaths. And where was the city, making them safe? Somebody gets into a bad situation with an Airbnb rental in a transitioning neighborhood. Then suddenly the city, which has been the enemy and the heavy-handed regulator, is supposed to have made them safe. So I understand why cities are a little reluctant to think about how to engage this. I do think that they need to open up and understand that this can solve a lot of their. Certainly, I think transportation is probably the easiest way for them to get into this, figuring out how to get people, as I said, from one corner of the metropolis to the other corner of the metropolis. I think that you are seeing an openness to sharing of resources in the wake of economic crisis. And so, Denver started to, the municipalities in Denver started to share essentially economic development resources when they realized that in the 1980s, when the bottom dropped out of the energy economy in the state, economic pain didn't know the difference between Denver and Aurora. They were all feeling it, so they felt like they had to do something that they had never done before. In Northeast Ohio, when philanthropies got together to pool their money to fund a group of intermediaries who would connect entrepreneurs with inventors at places like the Cleveland Clinic, with manufacturers, again, it was because they had fallen so low and they thought, well, God, we've got to try something that we've never tried before. So I think your question is moving in the right direction. I just haven't seen any place say, oh, this is going to solve some of our socioeconomic problems, and it's not just going to be for fancy people. I would imagine that someplace like New York or San Francisco or Seattle, right, which are places that are both incredibly conversant in sharing and technology, but also have significant income gap challenges, would be the first places to move on this.
Actually, I'm going to go to Dominique after this, and then to him, and then to you, just to follow them. But yeah.
Just on that point, I found the question fascinating. I want to share this. I think that's where we're headed anyway. And frankly, if you take a much broader perspective at this, we used to live in a world of 6 billion people in 1999. We're at 7.2.
I don't know why you're looking at me, but when someone
Resident
asks me for a number,
that was perfect.
You're the math guy.
That was perfect. And let me go back to you.
Yes.
In 2025.
Yeah, 9 billion.
I heard 8, but let's say either or, it's either a billion or 2 billion difference than today. So from a global context perspective, boy, capacity, right? There are 75. Yeah. In fact, where I'm going there is something called the Sun Corridor, which is one of 75 global megapolitans, if you will. Over 30 million or so in that megapolitan. There's 75 of those forming, according to a McKinsey study. Within those, there's ample opportunity for sharing platforms left and right. And I think they're going to spring up. The question for me is, what's government's capacity, nimble capacity, to be able to deal with some of these things as they come up?
And it's just to sort of quickly address your point, but then you've sort of given me something new to think about here. Will this be an economic necessity at some point in the future? I don't think so. In the sort of the context of, is the current model of taxi cabs or of hotels, is it economically vibrant? Yes, it is. It may become an economic necessity down the road because the sharing economy models disrupt the existing ones so that it's no longer viable as a business to have assets dedicated to short-term transportation or to short-term accommodation. I also think that, I've said this before, but it's worth saying again that, these represent sort of productivity enhancing technological advances, as in you're getting more output from the same inputs or same output from less inputs, better use of capital. So in the long run, they will lead to economic growth. And in some sense, they will then become a necessity in that they will be the model. I think another place, going back to a point that sort of that Alex raised, and I'm glad you sort of raised the Sun Corridor thing and the notion of a sort of megapolis, right?
Yes.
Because if you sort of look outside the context of the United States and to, for example, India and China and other countries that have to build cities for hundreds of millions of people. I think my colleague Paul Romer says 2 billion people will have to be accommodated in new cities. That's like 200 New Yorks. There's certainly a tremendous amount of opportunity and perhaps even a necessity to think about these asset-efficient models of urban living. If you're going to have to build cities for sort of the populations outside the United States. I mean, they tell me that between New Delhi and Mumbai, which is, I think, like, a 900-mile stretch or something, will be one continuous sort of urban corridor at some point. And, we're going to need infrastructure for this. And if you have asset-light models, maybe they sort of become viable, or they become a substitute for sort of the shanty towns that otherwise might.
The Sun Corridor is from here to Phoenix,
Okay, so that's
north of Phoenix, actually.
It's a good segue for some of the stuff Dominique Turk has been doing. And I was actually going to ask you, but obviously I don't want to preclude the question of, one thing we didn't talk about that's been true in a lot of European cities is things like spectrum sharing, right? Wi-Fi hotspots. It's been a much more regulatory problematic one here when people try to do that for free. Weirdly enough, in a lot of European cities, you get to be the representative of Europe here, by the way. You can just speak for Europe. Even with the regulatory framework somehow being more dense, there seems to be much more of this going on in a way that is either facilitated or not opposed by municipalities.
Well, the discussions I see in Europe currently are exactly the same ones as we have in this room. So it's in every city and in every country. More or less difficult because the political situations are different or the city situations are different, but it's the same kind of discussion. And I think that the last questions were really taking a turn where I think it's really interesting and important to dig. Because a series of words disturb me. Sharing economy is actually, is it really sharing? Because we pay, so it's a trade in most of the cases. Okay, so it's not sharing; it's a commercial exchange. It's an economy. So and therefore, let's be very careful with the word sharing. Yes, in some cases we can share for free. In this case, it might be a common, but it's different. It's not a sharing economy. It's an economy of commons. And we have to be extremely careful with that. So I haven't heard about solidarity sharing or solidarity economy. This is a different word. We have it, but it is in a different world too. So if we stick to sharing economy, the Uber or the B&B of this world and so on, it's a trade. And the interesting point by combining both city and sharing economy is that a city was always a place to trade. The origin of city is markets. Yeah. Why did we come to markets? Because we reduced the transaction cost and we could sell and buy easily within a few yards. That was it. So, and what is sharing economy doing today? It's recreating a market with an infinite number of suppliers and an infinite number of takers. Of buyers, which is quite interesting because somewhere we create a sort of perfect market. Yes, but unfortunately, there was another market before, regulated with taxes, hotels, and so on. And suddenly this perfect market is like another layer on the other one. Problem, they interact. So if instead of taking a taxi, I take a Uber, the result is that the guy in his car, the Uber car, has a competitive advantage because he doesn't have to pay the same insurance, he doesn't have to pay the same taxes. In some cases, he may even forget to pay his taxes because he's not controlled. Same thing with a hotel room. So I think basically what this tells us here is it's a formidable opportunity to recreate the market I'm not against it, on the contrary, but it's also a fabulous challenge to re-regulate everything.
Absolutely.
And how are we going to we have to re-regulate. We don't have the option. So how are we going to re-regulate everything? Because if we don't, what we create is actually a parasite economy. Because these new elements are actually parasiting.
Well-
They get profit out of an existing system which is becoming too costly, and therefore they get some benefits. But by parasiting, who is paying the charges? Who is paying the taxes? Who is paying the social charges and so on? The traditional economy. It's unfair. So
Well,
how are we going to re-regulate?
I sort of feel like, I mean, perhaps you're being sort of,
A bit provocative.
you're being provocative by design, right? I mean, and you know, there's one philosophy that, like, you know, I've learned through experience not to argue about regulation with people from Europe. This is sort of like, you know, it's sort of always a losing battle, but you know, I see the
India is such a loosely regulated.
I know, yeah. It's sort of like, you know, I come from the free markets of India, yeah. There is sort of a vibrant, unregulated sharing economy there, actually. But, you know, it sort of, it makes you step back and say, what is the purpose of regulation, right? I mean, and one philosophy is that you regulate when the market cannot take care of itself in fulfilling some objective. The objective might be trade. The objective might be sort of equal access. The objective might be safety, you know, sort of providing the things that the market can't provide by itself. And so you need sort of intervention in order to make things work. You know, so as we think about re-regulating, and, you know, I'm not one of those people who says, well, regulation 2.0 is no regulation and transparency will lead to, I mean, there's clearly going to be a role for, like, you know, government and for, like, you know, providing certain things that we don't know what they are yet. But I think that, you know, at the core, while we re-regulate, I think it's important to sort of think about why the regulations exist in the first place, and whether the new marketplaces can take care of some of the things that we needed regulation for, rather than saying, well, you know, the taxi cab, sort of like the yellow cab in Manhattan, has to pay $1 million for a medallion, and now the UberX guy gets a $600 sort of like, you know, limo license and is sort of stealing their business. And, you know, to me, that's, well, you know, that's sort of like, you know, that's something sort of Darwinian about that, because, you know, there is a certain efficiency to the new model. And saying that we want to put up the same roadblocks to Uber, that in order to sort of level the playing field, is sort of it's a, you know, one has to tread carefully down that path, because, you know, there are efficiencies that are being created by these marketplaces, and we want to sort of give them a safe place to play and not stifle them. I had a point to make about public goods, actually, but yeah, so I'll say this real quick, and then, you know, I can see your hand sort of telling me to stop talking. But on the phrase sharing economy, I have seen people try to sort of popularize peer economy, shared economy. There was the indie economy, there was the freelancer economy. There are lots of other labels. Somehow the sharing economy label has stuck. So I get the feeling that in a few years, it will just take on a different meaning that will not coincide with what we think of as sharing. It will definitely have trade as a part of it. And trade and markets might be a good way of solving some of these public goods problems. But I think about the way social meant something else a few years ago. And LinkedIn perhaps was not happy about being associated with the label social, because they weren't a social network, right? They were a professional network. And now LinkedIn is part of social, and social means something else. So sharing economy probably will as well.
Good point.
We've been looking at this as some of our scenarios, and
Tell us who
Jump Cycler from Dell. Sorry. And one of the things that's been bothering us, and it had to do with the question about regulation, is where we have seen high levels of a sharing economy, and is in places where there are high levels, and we used to say a high level of homogeneity in their culture, but actually it was high level of homogeneity in their values. In the Nordics, Switzerland, to a lesser degree, Germany and France. And, you know, it almost is like when you're looking at a sharing economy and you start using the word regulation, what you're talking about is I'm going to have the government enforce a set of shared values that the culture doesn't have. And that doesn't seem to work. What works is when the government is actually facilitating the shared values that are already in place. So is that mean because of the nature of our country, and Congress demonstrates it on a regular basis, our inability to get to a consensus of shared values that maybe we can't execute a sharing economy?
You know, some of this has been not just government, right? I mean, you would know this from a corporate perspective that some of the opposition to this hasn't just been regulatory frameworks; it's been businesses that feel they're going to be undermined. I mean, the hotel one is a hybrid. In Europe, you know, Phone has set up free Wi-Fi sharing, which has had a really hard time in the United States, not because any city is opposing it, but because carriers who provide Wi-Fi don't want free hotspots that are going to compete with their franchise. And then, yes, they turn to government to enforce not a monopoly, but a franchise. So it's not just, you know, governments are worried about the ride issue; it's businesses are worried about the erosion of their.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, before I came back to Brookings, I worked as a lawyer on supporting cities and governments that wanted to regulate, and the people who we were lawyering against had very strong views about private property. And I think it would be really interesting if you could sort of map the rollout of the sharing economy and see how that played out around where people feel very, very strongly about the sanctity of private property, boundaries around private property, hands off my private property. People in cities are accustomed to a more porous boundary of public and private, because if your neighbor is thumping around upstairs and you can't sleep, you really do have a very clear sense that what he or she is doing with his or her private property directly affects you. If you're living on, 1 or 2 acres, whatever, they can turn the music up loud, they can do what they want to, and you're less enmeshed. And I think that's why these standards will have to be worked out locality by locality, as opposed to the state level or the federal level, because there's just a different set of norms about what we have, what we want to do with what's private and what's public and what's shared and what's not. And I think that's one of the great flexibilities about the U.S. system, is that you can have all of these experiments running. It will be interesting to see, though, how if these models can't scale, or where they hit barriers to scaling, and that what worked really well on the coasts is going to come to a dead stop in Dallas, but it'll work fine in Austin, or it'll work in Kansas City, Missouri, but not Kansas City, Kansas, or whatever. And how state legislatures will eventually try and come up with something, because they're the places that are more likely to have regulatory or have industry capture, right, from the hotelier industry or for something else. So this is going to be, there's no way to keep this out of the regulatory maw, and how we end up regulating it, I think, will say a lot about what our, not only what shared values we have at the front end, but what kind of shared values we work out in the political process at the back end. There's no way to keep this kind of fabulous and apolitical and clean and in the app world, because it's actual people doing it.
So you've been very patient. Sorry.
Thank you. So Mark Bonchek with Orbit. I want to actually build on the question about shared values, and to ask a question about, is there a sharing culture, or are there different sharing cultures? Many of you may be familiar with Bob Putnam's work on social capital. He was well known about Bowling Alone. What many people don't know is his earlier work, which looked at regions in Italy and found that success today was predicted by engagement and participation in choral societies hundreds of years earlier. The major finding being that cultures don't change, and that whether those shared values are in place or not, we're not going to fix that in the next few decades as sharing economy unfolds. So my question is, if your finding is that you have to reinforce existing shared values, and Bob Putnam's finding is those don't change, does that mean that one should look at the culture and see what kind of culture do we have, and therefore is there a different kind of sharing economy that we should put in place? For example, sharing assets and resources and infrastructure may be appropriate to some cultures, whereas direct human-to-human kind of sharing, where people have to connect to each other and pick each other up, may be appropriate for other cultures. I come from Boston, and people will respect the lawn chair put outside where you shoveled your car. That does not get touched, but to get people to actually talk to each other and do something, that might be very difficult.
Lawn chair economy.
No, I certainly think that you have a very good point. I mean, both of you make a really good point that if you contrast, say, the United States with Germany, with Brazil, with sort of Poland, with India, you're going to see different kinds of extents to which the sharing economy is embraced, in part because even without going to sort of the culture or the shared values, the willingness to sort of share your space with someone is very different across different sort of geographic areas. And so the extent to which the new services are sort of foreign to you is going to be different in different geographic areas. And that's something that I'm trying to measure, actually, in terms of sort of understanding the sort of the elasticity of this. You can sort of think of a familiar service as being legitimized. So, I mean, I guess the short answer is yes, definitely. I think it's very important for researchers to look at sort of the existing culture of not just sharing, but the things that are different about access over ownership, and see how that varies across geographic areas in terms of both catalyzing certain kinds of sharing and predicting what's going to come.
In a sense, the sharing economy has a great model in the micro-enterprise finance world.
Yep.
If you think about that, some of you might be aware of the Acción International in Boston and in Latin America. And, that same dollar gets recirculated through the neighborhood for not even mom and pop shops. These are micro individual actors in a market. You're leveraging that dollar, giving it back, and it's that peer network that keeps that dollar moving. I think there's an interesting thesis maybe at stake here, where you look at the difference between the sharing economy in the developing world and in the most advanced economies. Because if you look at it in the context of the most advanced economies, what you have, I think, are contradictory economic development goals, right? That individual example where in Tucson there might be somebody in my neighborhood on the far east side of town organizing folks for coming to downtown for work. That model, I mean, there's a market, there's a well-established market, there's regulation, there's a competitive landscape around it with the taxis and so on, all these existing services. So when you undermine that, then you're going against what is in essence the current prevailing economic development model, right? But I just think that applies differently when you're looking at, say, that same situation in Paraguay, in a suburb outside of Asunción. Then the dynamic changes. I mean, you mentioned the buses, people hanging on the minivans or whatever. That happens all over the world, as we know. And they do it out of necessity. So I think it'd be interesting to dive deep to see if there could be any subtleties in the difference between the sharing economy in the advanced industrialized nations and that of developing countries.
Yeah, what Jennifer calls the sharing economy for fancy people, right?
Right.
Oh, yeah,
So,
yeah.
I like to be called a fancy
Well, we are, I think at the end, I do think it's a really good way to end it. And if we had more time, this notion of how to dynamic, technology enhanced, inherently non-bureaucratic, mega corporation ways of people meeting their needs happening very fluidly. also then feed back into some sort of commons experience. I mean, it's wonderful to believe that everybody's suiting their needs collectively through different apps that allow them to hook up with people either in a barter system or a commercial transaction will make everything flow perfectly. But it probably still won't build roads, and it won't build light rail, and it won't. And that's got to come from somewhere, and there has to be some degree of commons, and it may collect the garbage, but it won't maintain the dump. So there's a whole series of things, and we'll have David have the middle
I
word.
just want to say that Governor West was sitting in here, and he's launching the 3:30, the next part of our plenary session, and a lot of the things that I think he touched on here will be at least part of his thinking about cities and data, and so I just want to make sure everybody knows that's coming up.
Cool. So this was a really compelling discussion. Thank you all, and we have a break now.
Yeah, feel free to.
Okay, so we have a break till 3:30. Thanks.